So hello everyone, I'm Simon Bourne. I'm Programme Director for the Midlands Decision Support Network, and I'm also a Principal Consultant at the Strategy Unit. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat box, just let people know who you are, what you do, where you're from, then that would be great. And then we know who's in the room. And welcome to Insight 22. If this is your first event, it's our annual Festival of Learning and Sharing events for the NHS, local government and other partners across health and care. It's hosted by the Midlands Decision Support Network in association with the Strategy Unit. And this year's two-week festival has been running since last Monday, and it's reaching its exciting finale on Thursday. So this year, the theme is the science and craft of decision making, and we've had loads of speakers from health and care providers, from system leaders, from academics, and some great individuals, all with various different perspectives. And we've all been considering about how we make decisions in health and care, some of the processes, some of the constraints, some of the politics. We've been thinking about the ethics of decision making. And we've been thinking about what it's been to date and maybe what decision making might look like in the future. So as you know, everything's online and anyone's welcome to attend. We've had almost 4,000 people signed up to the festival. We've had hundreds at most of our events. And so if you haven't already, please do take a look at our wider programme and sign up for a few more. Everything's recorded as well. So if anything that you've missed, you can catch up on. And I'm sure one of my colleagues and post the link to the previous programme and all the sessions that have already happened in the chat box. So today's session is about decision making in the new health and care landscape. So as I'm sure most of us on the call know, ICBs formed earlier this year, but this session is about what's it like to be a decision maker in this new environment. Are there particular opportunities or challenges that ICB leaders are facing in relation to their decision making? And perhaps are there particular actions that they can take to improve the quality of their decisions, either individually as leaders or as a collective in their systems? One of the, I suppose, recurrent themes through this festival has been that decision making, it's an absolutely core central leadership skill, but actually a lot of the time leaders don't really get that much of a chance to focus in depth on the practice of decision making, on their environment and what it is they're actually doing when they're making decisions. So it's really great to have this opportunity today to reflect with a few of our system leaders. So we've got a fabulous panel. I'm joined by Amanda Sullivan, who's Chief Executive of Nottingham and Nottinghamshire ICB, and is also Chair of the Midlands Decision Support Network. I'm joined by Toby Sanders, who's Chief Executive of Northamptonshire ICB, a little way from Toby. And I'm also joined by Shane Devlin. And Shane Devlin is Chief Executive of Bristol, North Somerset and South Gloucestershire ICB. So we've got some representatives from the Southwest as well. So these three together, they're going to be having a conversation about decision making together. So they're going to be talking about the context that they're operating in at the moment, what happens in reality. They're going to be talking about some of their ideas for what better might look like. And we're mostly going to be listening in. So I'm going to try and sort of set them up in a few directions in order to get their reflections. I'll probably put my hand up to intervene and nudge them in a few particularly interesting avenues. But mostly this is intended as a bit of a fishbowl. So us looking in as three senior leaders talk about their decision-making practice. So throughout the session, please do post your comments or your questions in the chat box. So towards the end of the session, we'll be putting on some of those and getting our panel to reflect on them. So thank you, all of you, for joining me. I wanted to kick us off by just giving each of you an opportunity to tell us about what's it like to be a decision maker in your role at present. So maybe if we could kick off with Amanda, that would be great.
Hi everyone, it's really good to connect with you and to contribute to this discussion, and as Simon said, it's a really important area. So in the integrated care systems, we're moving from separate organisations making probably quite fragmented decisions that suit their individual organisational objectives and often quite a transactional way of operating and making decisions, quite often bilateral kind of things as well. And we're now moving into a space where what we need to try and do is bring those perspectives together. And so my sort of leadership role is very much trying to make sure that we create the climate and the environment so that we do get better decisions that are more inclusive of different perspectives rather than specific sector or organisational decisions, with the absolute pinpoint being the population that we serve. So I think the prize will be that we are able to serve our population better by bringing together the kind of operational insights, clinical and care professional insights, citizens insights, voluntary sector insights into different pathways of care, different models of care, and different decisions about how we allocate the resources. And most importantly, trying to shift health outcomes and tackle health inequalities as well. So that will be complex, because if you're moving resources, often you're moving it from somewhere to somewhere, and decisions around that will need to be very rounded, taking all of those perspectives into account. The other thing I think in terms of our context is that integrated care boards are one NHS body within systems which are made up of NHS, local authorities and other organisations as well. And they are sort of quite complex and adaptive systems, and there's lots of systems and networks within systems, whether then social networks or sector networks, professional networks. And so again, all of those different decision makers will be making decisions that seem rational and optimal to them, but will have knock-on consequences for other parts of the system that they may or may not be aware of. And I think where we are now in the early days of integrated care systems is those knock-on consequences are starting to be understood better across the system. So I think some of the constraints that we are under are that inevitably people see risk differently, and everybody thinks they carry the lion's share of the risk because we all see risk in the way that we see it. That is human nature. It's not people are bad or anything like that. It is how we're wired to see things. And so again, that is part of our leadership role in integrated care systems, is to try and help to get that understanding of risk across the whole system, how we manage the risk and how we share the risk in a way that is proportionate and in the population's overall interests. And that is really quite a live issue with things like urgent emergency care, people waiting for ambulances, people waiting for home care, etc. So there are some real live issues where that is playing through at the moment. And I think for us, decisions are often, they may seem suboptimal, but actually they're often a trade-off. We're often trading off political judgments, what's feasible, what's policy, some must be dones, what levels of resources we have, priorities and things like that. So decisions are often trade-offs between a lot of quite complex things, and we have to take the time, probably more time than we have done previously, around consensus building, and that can butt up against operational urgent expediencies or urgent situations. So it's always a balance between those. But in terms of the opportunities, I do think, as I say, the prize is that we get better decisions that have a better impact on shorter and longer term outcomes, people's access and experience of health and care systems as well, if we can find solutions that really properly bring those different perspectives to bear, rather than a predominance of one sector's views over the other. And I think evidence and analysis is a good tool to use, because it can neutralise, if it's sound evidence-based, looking at it from a number of different aspects, it can neutralise some of the sort of political contentions or or other things, and it can give fresh insights. And often this is counterintuitive because people have been, held a strongly formed set of beliefs for generations actually, and have operated in that particular context. So some of what we are doing, some of the new insights into our populations are counterintuitive and have to be worked through sometimes and understood better. But I think building on the fact that we all have got our systems in place now, we've got the architecture there, we've got the relationships there, it's building on those strengths and on our community assets to really get better decisions with a shared then sense of purpose and objectives and delivery plans as well. And then a bit just to say, if we are all wired now, we've got our governance in place and things, we can make sure we keep building on that to wire in this more broader perspectives into our decisions so that we get better decisions. Thank you, Simon.
Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing those initial reflections. Toby, maybe I could have your initial reflections, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Simon. And good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you all and part of the conversation that we'll have with you and that you're listening to, that we're having with the 3 or 4 of us on screen as well. So similar kind of opener then to Amanda's kind of comments, a few just reflections from me on where we are at the moment in terms of decision making and ICBs in particular. I just wanted to look at this from 2 lenses really. There's a number of things from my perspective that actually make now one of the best times and most productive times to be involved in decision making within health and care that I can recall in my kind of 20 years within the NHS and previously working in local government, and then just to reflect on some of the challenges and complexities I think within the environment that we're operating in. And I'm sure as we go through this conversation, inevitably we're going to build on the 3 of us, aren't we, in terms of the pieces we touch on. So from a kind of the positive perspective here, I think there's a number of things that make this a really good moment and place to be involved in ICBs and decision making at system level. 3 in particular to tease out. Firstly, I think we have a greater sense of clarity of purpose, and Amanda touched on this a moment ago, in terms of purpose of goal and what we're here to try and achieve. And whilst there's no surprises in the things that are captured in terms of the legislation statutorily around ICBs, I think that focus on the 4 aims in terms of improving outcomes, in terms of reducing health inequalities, in terms of use of resources, and in terms of the wider economic and community benefit, there's actually a kind of moral compass thing there, which certainly in our system, I'm sure others are the same, we constantly come back to say, well, how does what we're doing here, how do the decisions that we're taking sit against those kind of aims and those goals? So for me, the sense of purpose and clarity of purpose is a really helpful guiding frame in this, and locally we've done some really positive work over the last 12-18 months around things like local shared outcomes framework and agreeing a smaller number of things informed by the data and by the evidence that we think we can make a material difference to, particularly on outcomes and inequalities. So I think we're in a good place in terms of that clarity of purpose. I think we also are in a good place in terms of data and in terms of evidence base. And I'm sure we'll go on to talk about in conversation the challenges of how do you take and balance all of those things in terms of some of the more pragmatic political judgments often we have to make on some of these things. But actually, if I look at where we're at the moment in terms of things like population health management, some of the data that our team's working through, particularly jointly with local authority colleagues around insights data down to very local level, in terms of our places and in terms of our neighbourhoods, I think we are very well informed at the moment in terms of access to data intelligence, and equally the evidence base of what works. And I'm not just saying this because Simon's on the call and hosting things, but things like the DSU and those kind of, they're helping in terms of pointing us in the right direction of making good, high quality decisions. And the third piece I think I touch out in terms of positives, I think makes now a good time and place to be involved in this kind of arena, is that ICBs and the wider ICS kind of landscape is bringing together all of the kind of, or certainly many of the key players and key decision makers into the same rooms, into the same places to take decisions jointly together. That presents some huge challenges and complexities that I'll come on to in a moment, I'm sure we'll explore further. But as an opener, as something which actually I think it puts us in a place to make much better quality decisions that have a far greater prospect of actually sticking and being implemented, I think that collaborative model that we are in at the moment and trying to make work is really strong. And within that, the clinical voice in particular and professional voice, I think if there's one thing that's come out of the last couple of years in terms of living and working through the kind of COVID pandemic, it's been that kind of status that experts, that science, that data, that the evidence has and needs to hold within the decisions that we take. So 3 big kind of real sort of positives for me in terms of the landscape we're in: sense of clarity and purpose, data and evidence, and getting all of the key players together into the same room. But there are, you know, we are really open, and I'm sure we'll recognise this in our day-to-day work. There's some real challenges, aren't there, in terms of how we make the most of that backdrop. And again, just to stick with the number of 3s, 3 that I would tease out in my opening remarks. The first is complexity. I'm kind of hoping it's not just my system that grapples with this, but goodness, you know, we've got not just the kind of NHS complexity, government sector players, but some real complexity in terms of the way that our systems are constructed now. And if I talk to clinical and operational colleagues, they will often say to me, how on earth do we get decisions taken around here? We've got this kind of great idea, we've got this piece of work we want to take forwards. What's a collaborative doing? What's the ICB doing? What are individual trusts are doing? What health and wellbeing boards doing? What about our local area partnerships that sit within our health and wellbeing board? So we've got a pretty complex landscape that we've constructed, and navigating a way through that in terms of the right decisions in the right places and the right sequence to enable them to stick and be implemented, I think is a real challenge for all of us. My second on the kind of challenge front is the uncertainty of the landscape that we're currently operating in at the moment. I don't think many of us can probably think of years like the one that we've just been through in terms of, you know, political change, political uncertainty, that instability from a policy perspective, from a change in policy direction perspective, often quite significantly, as well as the kind of unprecedented events that we've lived through. The climate that we're in at the moment does feel particularly volatile and particularly uncertain, and navigating a way through that and making the best decisions that you can at a point in time is, I think, a real challenge for us all. And then my final thing, Simon, just briefly before handing to Shane, the operational context we're in. You know, I don't think any of us can sit here in a conversation on the 29th of November and not reflect on where we are in terms of, you know, seasonal pressures, in terms of winter, in terms of those kind of challenges across our particularly urgent and emergency care systems, where we are on the money and the finances across not just the NHS but local government, our workforce challenges. And those things often drive, quite rightly, a need for really short-term, quick, rapid decision taking, which is often really tricky and challenging to balance against some of the science, some of the evidence, and some of the kind of process side of things that we might more routinely want to set out in a more structured way. So lots of positive, Simon, for me, which I'm keen to explore with colleagues, but equally recognising some really real challenges, and both of those things are true at the same time. Our job as leaders in these kind of spaces is to work out how we support our teams to navigate a way through that, to make the best decisions we can in those moments. Thank you.
Thanks, Toby. Really helpful to understand that. And Shane, I'll bring you in there.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So thanks, Amanda and Toby. And I'm not going to repeat what either of you have said, because actually a lot of it feels exactly where I am as well. I suppose a couple of things. I've only recently come into the NHS. I spent 26 years working in the health and social care system in Northern Ireland, which is a very different system. It was integrated back in the mid-70s, and integrated trusts were created in the 1990s. So I'm coming into a situation now where actually the decision-making framework is very different from the decision-making framework that I'm used to. And actually, Simon, you opened the conversation about 3 decision makers. I'd argue we're not decision makers. I would argue we are the facilitators of decisions that have to be made. And that's not the same as being the decision maker, because actually what I'm very quickly understanding is the complexity of the partnership nature of decisions to be made. And I think what's quite interesting, when I came into public service, whatever it was, 30 years ago. So I was told 3 things are really important in making decisions. One is about the speed of the decision in public service. The other one is about the data. And the third one is about getting engaged people so that you can get buy-in. And you can't actually ever have all 3 of them, because they're actually antagonistic. You can't have speed and data and engagement, but you've got to decide where you are. I think when we're in this new context of decision making, I think there's many more elements over and above that simple model. There's politics, there's ethics, there's policy, there's partnership. And I suppose, therefore, the challenge that I'm looking at, relatively new to the NHS, but also of the new contract of ICBs, is how do we become facilitators of good decisions rather than decision makers? And if we're to become facilitators of good decisions, then it is about partnership. And it is about, you know, what is a good partnership? Partnership is about trusting each other and needing each other. And therefore, how do you build decisions across a network of partners? And I've seen, I think, from my previous life, where we did work in an integrated way, and you did have to make decisions as partners, and you would make an agreement on something that you have to agree on for the system, but you know that you, in your own constituency, and whether that's your own trust board or whether that's your own local population, will be very difficult to carry, but you actually have to commit to that decision-making framework. So I can see that in a similar way here, is in a sense that as we start to bring together our partners, and then in the Bristol, North Somerset and South Gloucester area, we've brought together all of our partners on our ACB board. Okay, so when we're making decisions, we're making it with all of them, 3 local authorities, 4 providers, etc. And what's interesting is that dynamic we're beginning to work through about where does sovereignty for the decisions that are taken lie, because I want the sovereignty to be system first, and therefore we make decisions on behalf of a system as a collaborative. But actually, the reality is we still have really deep ingrained decision-making frameworks in our own home organizations. And how do we begin to make joint decisions when we have individual accountability frameworks? Because the decision needs to be taken in the context of the accountability framework. And what we're starting to do now is to try and draw it, which it seems really simple, like just draw a decision-making framework. It's bound to be easy, but we're actually physically drawing what does a decision-making framework look like in BNSSG. And once you start drawing it, you realize actually that's pretty complex. So those are the kind of things we're getting into. It's a partnership of decisions, so a partnership of decision makers rather than I am a decision maker. And also then can we systematize it so we all understand the process of decision making, which, as I say, we're bringing to our board actually on Thursday, the final version of our decision-making framework, to help our whole board understand where decisions get made, who has the authority to make decisions on, and what basis will we make those decisions. So I'm really happy to get into the conversation. I just think that once you move into a system environment, the complexity of decision-making in the public sector, decision-making in the public sector is always hard, but the idea of doing it as a partnership is even harder. And I'd love to get into the conversation.
Thank you, Shane. Well, here we are. Now's the opportunity. So, you've all heard from one another, some initial reflections on your context, some of the features of that environment, some of those constraints and challenges, some of maybe the opportunities. So I'll give you some time now to essentially build on some of those points that you've heard, to respond to one another. Over to you.
Yeah, could I maybe just, Amanda had raised the point with regards to risk, actually, Amanda, and that's becoming so important to us, is can we get a shared understanding of risk across the system to help us make better decisions? And I'm speaking from my system, I think we're at the beginning of that ladder of understanding risk. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that, Amanda and Toby, in terms of how we get a shared understanding of risk, because what's my risk in my organization may be so different from another partner. I wondered whether you have any thoughts on that.
Thank you, Shane. And I sort of really sort of resonated with your sort of appraisal of what's happening in your system. I think on the risk, I think when people are working really hard and as Toby said, the systems are under pressure, inevitably you see the world as it is around you. And I mean, our chair talks about different valleys of thought, and that is inevitable, actually. And so I think what we've tried to do to start to move this forward is a couple of things. One is about how it feels and day-to-day experiences. So we've done a few kind of system-wide frontline staff kind of sharing their everyday decisions that they're having to make and compromises in their sort of professional roles across health and care, and to recognise that actually the greatest acuity and the greatest sort of risk in a time limited fashion does start with the sort of people waiting in the community for an ambulance, the emergency department, but then also in the hospitals and in other areas. But I think what what I think we do need to try and get to a common understanding of, and what I've tried to sort of expose a little bit in our system, is that actually at all parts of the system, people are having to manage risk and make compromises, and it isn't just about the acuity of people in the emergency department. Social workers are having to choose who to assess or not assess on that day. People are at home, you know, there's limited home care. So so I do think a start in response to what's the starting point, I do think a starting point is to try and expose and understand that from different perspectives, but acknowledge the difficulties that people are working with, and not be partisan around that, just acknowledge that and try. And I think your point about a facilitation type role, I do agree with that. Mm-hmm. I do think then the evidence and the analysis is important, and some of that is because data can be politicised, I think, and used to support a particular viewpoint or a particular point that people want to make. So I do think, and we sort of seem to have spent a lot of time looking at what metrics, and I do think there's a bit about just agreeing what the metrics are that are sensible metrics, and look at it from a different range of perspectives. So I think it's exposing how people feel and how people experience the risk. It's getting to a single version of the truth as far as you can, and that's always dynamic. And then I think it's trying to make decisions that are supportive, but with that sort of encouragement of mutual aid and things at different times, and understanding and appreciation of where people are helping to manage risk. There are other things like around the money, for example, risk sharing agreements and things like that, that again, I think a lot of the value of those is in the development of them and the agreement of them, as well as how they're enacted. So it's just, I think, again, having everybody engaged in those sorts of developing those risk sharing frameworks, triggers and escalations around operational risk, and sharing that out as well. So, but I do think it's important because it drives a lot of how people respond in difficult situations. Thank you.
If I may as well, just to respond, because Jane, I think you make a really good point on the risk front. Certainly, if I think about my career, some of the poorest decisions we've taken, and that I've been personally involved in taking, have been where we've taken very short-term, rapid decisions based on a very, very partial view and understanding about risk, particularly clinical risk, that was, or translated into a very strong advocacy view from particular parts of a system that felt the level of risk they were holding, which may well have been factually true, but we just couldn't evidence, was significantly greater and in excess of the level of risk that sat anywhere else. And in that kind of moment, and it often happens in the first 2 weeks of January, those kind of moments where the level of pressure that's building in different parts of the system. And we've, in previous years, have had conversations about trying to get to a point where we've got some clearer collective shared understanding of the level of risk that has been running different settings of care across the system, particularly clinically. So we've kind of mandated to our clinical leadership group some work this year to help with that. I think my view would be we've made some reasonable progress. I still think we've got some significant way to go in really being able to get to the point of understanding in a more nuanced way the differential levels of risk that have been run. And it plays back, Shane, the comment I was going to make, following on some of the things you said, to this dynamic, if I call it that, rather than tension almost, between system and organisational. Because interested actually in your experiences, having come into the NHS in England, having been working in previous system, because my guess is what you probably found is something which says integrated on the tin, but in practice is kind of semi-integrated, partially integrated, however we choose to describe it, because we've sort of integrated by putting lots of key partners into the same room, and we've done the same thing as you. We've got both of our local authorities, all of our trusts around the same table, but they've still got kind of a club and country thing going on in terms of, and you can't get away from that. And I think that's where this risk piece plays in, because folk like us in our sort of roles and in other partner organisations hold personal accountabilities for the things that their organisations do and the services they provide, and that's kind of human nature. And so I'm with you, Shane. I think a lot of this is about how we in our kind of roles create a space that convenes a set of conversations and a set of decision-making processes that enables us to get to collective views. I think where it's really tricky is what happens when you get stuck, and we're kind of getting stuck locally on a few things at the minute, and we're still trying to navigate our way through how we deal with that. I'll be welcome your observations on this.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, Toby. We in Northern Ireland, it was a different kind of decision making framework because social care and healthcare were fully integrated. As chief executive of the system that I ran in Northern Ireland, I had the complete money for everything. So I ran mental health, disability, family and childcare, social care, domiciliary care, and hospitals. I ran everything. And what was interesting is then we had 5 of those systems, but it came together into a mega system, okay, of the whole of Northern Ireland. And the point you make was then the home team, or playing for your club, playing for your country. And I actually remember very vividly, we were having a national conversation as partners as to what was the best way to deliver breast surgery for Northern Ireland. And we all 5 systems did breast surgery. And when you looked at it, you went, that's not the best way to run a country. And we came to a conclusion based on the evidence and looking at the flows of patients, etc. The best place to do breast surgery was in 3 geographies, and none of those geographies were in my system. So I could agree at a overall system level, the right thing for the country was for these 3 breast centres. But what that meant was I had to go back into my own system and tell my own board and tell my own population why I was agreeing to give up breast surgery in the southern part of Northern Ireland. And I suppose that's part of the challenge we're going to have moving forward in our decision-making process. And by the way, as an aside, the whole programme fell apart actually, because not enough had been done at a national and local level to engage the local politicians and the local communities. So there's a lesson in that as well. But the challenge for me was, in my organisation, it was technically the right thing to do for the country, to not dilute the resource and try and do breast surgery in every part of the country. It was the right thing, but the local consequences of that right thing were huge for people who felt they were losing access to breast surgery, around the corner from where they live. And I think we're going to get into that kind of situation in a system whereby, one of my local authority chief executives said to me last week at our board meeting, I will agree these things in this room and I will make sure that I can deliver them, but I can't tell you what my politicians are going to say, and I can't tell you what my politicians will say on the doorstep. So, we have to understand that we can have a collective decision-making process. And he says, I will support the decisions we make, but I can't control the governance of my organisation, which in the case of local authority is elected representatives. So it is a really complex situation that we find ourselves in, and that's why I think the facilitator of decision making is where we have to be. We have to be not a referee, but very much an enabler, a facilitator, because actually there isn't a referee in the system. There isn't someone who can ultimately say, well, I've listened to you all, the answer is X, go away and make it happen. It has to be a facilitated, consensus-based approach, which if everything is about investment and new thing, that'll be really easy. But if it's about disinvestment and movement and change, it'll be flipping hard. So that's the kind of thing we're trying to build into a pre-baked decision-making framework. So we don't have that conversation in the heat of the battle. We have that conversation when we're defining the processes, because in the heat of the battle is the wrong place to be having a discussion about the decision. So, I'm trying to bring some of the learning across. Your point about integration, I think it's very funny. A colleague of mine who I was speaking to last week from Northern Ireland said, what is it like in the NHS in England? And I said, well, first of all, I think there's brilliant stuff going on and the people are amazing. But it is the most disintegrated system I've ever seen in my entire life, because it's been grown up. It's grown up with its own accountabilities, its own objectives. It's competition based. So I think we have a journey to travel to really get to integrated decision making, because we've got disintegrated organizations. And I think that's, for me, that's the starting point for my decision making journey, I think.
So, and I think we started to talk about this really, but maybe you could steer your conversation towards a bit more about how decision making is happening in reality now, appreciating its early days. But do you get a sense of what good and bad decision making is looking like at the moment? Maybe some of the factors that might be supporting or undermining you, maybe a sense of how this compares to your previous roles. Well, Shane, you reference yours, but it'd be interesting to hear about from your perspective, Toby and Amanda as well.
If I just make one small point, I think decision making at the moment is really hard because of the real hard pressure we've got for winter. I'm just being honest, and I think a lot of the decisions we're taking are very short term because we're just in the eye of a storm. And I think we'd make better decisions when we have the opportunity to have time and thought. And that's my sort of reflection to begin with. Our board meetings at the moment and our system decisions are very focused on, can we get through winter? And I appreciate that's where we are, accept, but I think we'll make better decisions when we can get through winter. But that, I mean, I wonder whether Toby and Amanda feel the same, but certainly for me, it feels a bit of a battle at the moment in terms of getting ready for winter.
I mean, I certainly recognise that, Shane, as a touch on my opening comments. I think that the operational realities of where we are at the moment, and also I know all of our patches will be different. Certainly from a Northlands perspective, our system financial position is kind of heading way out from where it needs to be. So we've got Julie and Kelly sessions next Monday in escalation mode, etc., and that drives, understandably, that's that those functions and roles are there for a reason, but it does drive a focus on the very short term. And the very, how do we kind of get through the next immediate period, as opposed to some of the longer term things that we need to concentrate on. I think, Simon, one of my reflections on how decision making, the sort of reality of how things are feeling at the moment, and just to make a comparison, I suppose, across different parts of my career, that if I think about the way that, to the collaborative point we're discussing here about getting people together into the same room and collectively kind of taking that step jointly to say this is something we are going to do and take forwards, there's a huge strength in that, certainly compared to, I've worked in CCGs and worked in PCTs previously, all of which felt much more commissioner provider kind of stuff. And we still obviously still have that dynamic. I'm not naive enough to think we've suddenly managed to move to a world where that doesn't exist and isn't a thing. But having sat in many of those sorts of rooms and redesign and improvement processes, and Amanda, you and I have been around at East Midlands for a while in those sorts of organisations, if I reflect back, we produce things like commissioning plans on an annual basis. We put a very clear setting out of what a particular group of people thought was the right thing to do, and with a particular kind of perspective on that. How often did those things really have genuine collective cross-system kind of support and buy-in that would have enabled them to be implemented fully, particularly clinically and operationally across teams? Sometimes the answer was absolutely yes, and we've done brilliant work over kind of previous years on some of those improvement and redesign pieces. But I can think of a lot of occasions where actually it was pretty clumsy, and we kind of sort of set down some stuff that we may well have thought well intentionally was the right thing to be trying to shift or the right thing to try and move. But did the providers in particular that needed to respond in that situation have any intention of kind of moving that direction? I don't think we got that level of alignment and goal congruence that's needed to move these things on. So for me, whilst notwithstanding all the challenges we're describing, the fact that we do at least have a space that enables us to come together in that kind of way is of itself positive progress. It's slightly more integrated than where we were previously, and therefore to this kind of conversation with Shane about other experiences and fragmentation, slightly less fragmented, but the fault lines are still very much still there between organisations, and those tensions do quite often drive us back, particularly when things are pressured, and particularly when organisational sort of status and kind of accountability comes into play with it.
Mm.
Yeah, I would agree with Toby's reflections as well, and I think, just thinking about what's been said, I think there are, when we're thinking about things like resource allocation and configuration discussions, like Shane said, I think we do have to act as sort of facilitators and try and bring the viewpoints together into some proposals or outcomes that can, everyone can sort of go with and are deliverable. I do think though also we are sometimes asked, I think we do sometimes act as referees, particularly in the heat of the moment, actually, because of some of the dynamics that Toby and Shane discussed. So I think it is a little bit situation dependent in terms of how we sort of flex in that, but I think refereeing with a view to trying to get the best population decision and move away a little bit from the organisational viewpoints a bit. And one of the things I think that, even though probably at a strategic partnership level, we kind of, I think, as Toby said, the behaviours have changed massively from 2 years ago. But it's quite interesting, because sometimes I sort of, in my day, sometimes I think, oh, we've had a real breakthrough and things are, working really differently and having some different impact. But then there's flashpoints where things definitely haven't moved on. So it's quite, I suppose, because it's quite a new and developing thing, there are contradictions there in terms of that. And I think sometimes the sort of commissioner-provider and the provider-provider competition bit does play out. And I think it's because people's frame of reference is that, and so they're continuing to behave, or we're continuing to behave according to our frame of reference or our biases. And again, that is inevitable and will take a little bit of time to overcome. So I think it is definitely developing, but it won't happen overnight. And to sort of penetrate different parts of the system, all parts of the system, I think it will take a bit longer. I think on Toby's initial opening remarks as well, around a clarity of purpose associated with the 4 aims, I agree, it is a really helpful thing. And I do think an opportunity is to shift the NHS from being a kind of a treatment service to a civic partnership, and thinking how we mobilise all of our community assets in a much more rounded way. And that is so we get that factored into decisions, not just the clinical perspectives. It's more of a holistic view about what people's needs are and what's driving people's health. So again, that is work in progress. But yeah, I do agree with that. There's contradictions in what we do every day, I think, and different parts of the system are at different stages, and different decisions need a slightly different approach. Thank you.
Well, I'd to follow on from that, Amanda. I think it would be lovely if we can get to the point, and we're going to try and get there, is that our decision-making framework is embedded in our outcomes framework. So actually the decisions we choose to make are based on the things that we said were important to us in our purpose and our outcomes. And therefore the work we're trying to at the moment is to really get in our own system a really strong shared purpose, a really strong shared set of outcomes, and a really strong strategy to move forward, so that then when we get to hard decision making points, we can lean against that strategy or that pre-agreed position. Because actually we've some of it even now, we've had some short-term decisions we've had to make about winter, and people have said, are already saying, yeah, but Shane, that's anti-strategic, it needs to be aligned to the long, which is brilliant. That's what I want people to be saying. So therefore the importance of getting our outcomes framework right, whether that's giving every child the best start in life, whether that's looking at mental health, whatever it is. And then we can always lean against that framework as part of our decision-making conversations. And although I think we have a journey to travel, I'm certainly seeing green shoots where people are starting to really appreciate that, saying, yeah, okay, I can understand that. And they're not thinking about making individual decisions in their individual organisation without paying some regard to the system's outcomes, which is great. Doesn't mean they accidentally slip back. We had one of our providers who just decided to make a decision a couple of weeks ago, which absolutely had a systems impact, and they didn't think about the systems impact, they didn't think of the outcomes. There's just behaviours we've got to try to get to, but at least if we can get that kind of outcomes framework that we all sign up to. And also take Toby's point, this idea of commissioning. I mean, I come from a system where commissioning died a few years ago, and actually what we moved to much more was an set of adult conversations, as opposed to maybe adult-child commissioning kind of approach. And I'm just looking forward to seeing how that plays out, because it's hard to have adult conversations. Sometimes it's easier just someone says, no, Shane, just get on with it, and this is what you've got to do. And it's difficult to say, no, everyone has a view, everyone has a point, and actually everyone being the adult in the conversation. That's pretty tricky. Can I ask, just to also help me understand, earlier on, I can't remember which of the two you mentioned the concept of ethics and ethics as part of a decision-making process. Have either of you progressed that very far? Because I know we talk about it, but I don't see it being progressed usually. Have either of you managed to progress a really strong ethical approach to decision-making?
It's a really good question, Shane. I'm just reflecting on times when I think we've kind of got closer to bringing this to the fore. Actually, through COVID, our system response established, I'm sure others did similar things like this, an ethics cell that brought together public health leads together with clinical leads. And it was the place that we kind of held to inform decision taking based on the right or the optimal, or in some cases, least worst thing to do in different situations. And your question is a good prompt, because I don't think we've carried that kind of learning or experience forwards into our current operating. And it added some value to that in terms of something Amanda said a few moments ago about good quality decisions are often helped by coming back to the evidence and depersonalizing, deorganizationing kind of the things that we're looking at. And actually that ethics piece was one of the strongest ways of drawing that in. Really good point.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're similar. We did have, there's kind of ethical committees around individual clinical decisions, and the ethics cell that Toby mentioned around, which we did early on, but has sort of moved to the side. But I think it's coming back more to the fore, because as we're looking to allocate resources differently and health equity and inequalities, I do think that raises potentially a set of ethical things around how you allocate resources. And the processes and the principles that we use to make decisions, including the ethical basis, you know, are the sorts of things that are challengeable if you were thinking about, is your decision publicly defensible and transparent and everything else. So I agree with Toby. I think this is an area where we do need to develop that, and possibly broader than individual systems that cover our more kind of larger geographical areas in terms of how the NHS sort of goes about making decisions about resource allocation. It's so I think it is a really live topic that we'll have to revisit. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And then I saw something pop up in the chat there, just to say that there was an ethical session. I think Simon, you can come in on that. Yeah,
that's right. Yes, so we had the world's first professor for the public understanding of philosophy. So there's definitely a session that people are might be interested in, and also a report I've just signposted, which Angie undertook, setting out an ethical framework for considering one of our recent reports. The time's just flown by all, and I want to draw in a few of the comments and questions from our audience. One of the things that's come up is about the impact of fear potentially on decision-making processes, and also potentially about the impact of performance management structures and how those might, potentially have an impact on you trying to play this sort of referee facilitator type role. And I just wondered if anyone wanted to respond to that or reflect on how fear and performance management structures might impact on those processes.
I mean, I do think that there is different levels of jeopardy attached in the NHS to different performance targets, and some of those are driven by central government in terms of what the electoral mandates are and what the sort of key priorities are. And I do think that does drive behaviours. So I think decisions will be made on the basis of differential jeopardy and focus on the bits that people are more likely to, potentially lose their jobs over or see that personal jeopardy or reputation around. So I do think that when at the beginning I sort of said, I think a lot of decisions are trade-offs. I think that is one of the drivers of decisions inevitably. And that can be a positive thing because it drives concerted effort in big areas of focus, whether it's cancer or urgent care or ambulance turnaround times. But it can mean that people end up operating with blind spots and certain areas get very much prioritised and high profile, and then other areas are less, that should have more focus, get less focus. So I definitely think it's a really good observation, and it definitely does drive prioritisation, decisions, attention, and the profile of particular different, elements of performance.
Shane or Toby, did you want to come? Toby, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with what Amanda just said. I think I'm kind of quite pragmatic about this. It kind of is what it is. I know at times, and certainly early in my career, there were points I got quite agitated and frustrated about the impact of kind of national or political intervention and focus on particular areas, and we might all want to see some of those things move, but the reality is that is the system that we operate in. And from my point of view, it's about consciously acknowledging when we are taking decisions of that sort of nature. And Shane talked earlier on about at the moment we're taking a lot of very short-term, close to our nose decisions to just try and ease things operationally, which are not necessarily where we want to be heading kind of strategically in terms of the focus on early intervention and prevention and the focus on inequalities, etc. I think for me it's about just acknowledging when we're in those sort of moments, because when you are, and thankfully at the moment my patch isn't quite here, but I know when I talk to colleagues across other areas who've got much more significant issues around things like ambulance handover delays, and we've got national processes that are monitoring on a half-hourly basis how many crews are stacked outside particular sites. That's the reality of the world we operate within, and we have to be able to deal with that, as well as kind of finding a way to retain a focus on, which is why I think the focus on the kind of 4 core aims is so important. And our outcome framework, I was really interested in what Shane was describing about how you've taken outcomes framework into decision-making framework. We've done some great work for the first time properly in Northamptonshire around outcomes framework, jointly with local authorities, public health supported, which has helped us to kind of distill down to a smaller number of things that we're saying really matter, that we could shift the dial on. What we haven't done yet, I don't think, and I'm interested in what you were describing, is take that further step of how do you kind of hardwire that into decision making as a point of reference, to keep bringing us back to that.
Yeah. Can I also just on the fear bit, Simon? I think if because I am in a system that is at the lower end of performance. Okay, so if you look across the southwest, we're struggling, and if you look at BNSSG, I've come into a system that I know there are struggling. I suppose my greatest concern is that if people are afraid to make decisions, then they're afraid to fail, then nothing will change. So part of the job, I think, of the ICB is to provide cover, to sort of be that umbrella across the system to say, actually, we'll take the flak, and we're new enough to maybe take some of that flak to allow people to try things. Because if people are afraid to fail, then they're afraid to try. If they're afraid to try, then we're bust. So there is something about trying to get a balance. Now, I am in a beautiful place of ignorance, okay? So I haven't been in the NHS for any more than 6 months, okay? So I am in that kind of, I'll be brave and I'll try things, okay? But there is something about if the ICB can't create a little bit of a protected space to try stuff, then we really are in trouble. And that's really what I think the ICB has to try and do, is take cover from its newness, take cover from it does have some political capital at the moment. Let's try and use that. We also need to think about what's going to come out of, so we've got an operating framework at a national level, of course, but the new work from Patricia Hewitt and all, where is this all going to in terms of what are the rules around what are the performance indicators and the rules around ICB? So for me, my greatest worry would be that people are afraid to try, and therefore we have to create a framework to allow them to try things and then be prepared to protect them, because sometimes you try things and they don't work, but that's just the way life is.
And I think, Shane, that's where the power of the collective is hugely important, because actually, rolling back to previous years of much more fragmented organisations, it's going to be much more isolated kind of decision taking within that. An entire collective system coming together with local government saying, no, we think this is the right thing to do for our population because is a much stronger and frankly safer at times, personally and organisationally, place to be in terms of holding ground to that. And I think we're just starting to discover some of that. We've taken that stance on a number of things actually, which have resulted in, I think, a different level of acceptance might be the right word by others externally, that is what we are going to do, but because we think it's the right thing to do.
I think that's another thing that's coming through in the questions, and you sort of started talking about. Yeah, it's how do we create that space? You know, how do we create that space where you can start thinking about some of these strategic, long-standing issues alongside all of the sort of things in front of your nose. You know, how do you create that, to come to your point, Shane, you know, that sort of psychological safety to actually try something and look to do something different. And I wondered if any of you have any other reflections on that, how you protect and create that space for those sorts of decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can do it, and I agree with Shane, we should do it. I think the way we can, if you like, protect ourselves, if you like, or it has to have a compelling narrative, and it has to be well thought through, and it has to move in the direction that we strategically want to go in, whilst it might, you know, whilst helping with the sort of day-to-day pressures. So, you know, lots of us are experimenting or implementing new models of care to try and help with the urgent care pressures. We can't ignore those, because otherwise we're not going to ever get into a better place. And yes, some of it is about operational, you know, efficiencies, but a lot of it is systemic, different issues to do with population health and behaviours, and where we've got capacity in different parts of the system and some misalignment. So I do think, so long as we, as Shane said, that there is and Toby, as long as there is a strength of voice that's a consensus, there's an evidence base, it will help in the more medium to longer term, alongside the kind of other must be dones or immediate things, and it gets us all in the right direction of travel. I do think, I mean, you know, a lot of people have done that around some of the, you know, discharge processes and home care and things like that, done different stuff with local government, and it's that kind of thing that I think we, you know, is justifiable, and we should be pushing at the boundaries of. So I think some of it happens, but you have to sort of pick your areas, and there has to be a sort of a compelling, you know, sort of rationale and evidence base behind it to sort of stick your head above the parapet, really. Thank you.
And I think, Simon, part of it for me is less about how do we create space, but how do we bring into the things that we are doing anyway, the kind of insights or intelligence. I'm really mindful when people were doing their introductions earlier on in the chat function, I think we've got a lot of our kind of BI community, a lot of our population health management community on today's call. And something I'm increasingly asking in our organisation is, when we get into the decisions that we are taking day to day, we might not have the space for the perfect information or for the perfect insights we want, but in the context we're in, with the things that we are taking decisions on, what would those perspectives bring to the decision making that will be underway over a varying timescales, which isn't always the kind of big long-term space, but is actually how do we make sure we've got the population health view, the clinical evidence perspective, etc., into the things that we are doing. And again, I think we've seen that with things like elective recovery and some of the focus on clinical prioritisation through that, which I think has brought alongside that the kind of health inequalities perspective piece as well in a really powerful way.
Thank you, Toby. Shane, any final points from you? Just because I think then we're gonna look to close.
Yeah, I suppose the only thing we haven't mentioned at all in the conversation is the role that the population, the public carer, the patient plays in decision making at a systems level. And I mean, we've talked about, you know, hearing the voices of data, as Toby suggested, and actually intelligence, you know, absolutely hearing the voice of the politics and hearing the voice of partners. But the one thing we didn't at all cover today was hearing the voice of the, you know, the patient, the client, the carer, the public, the family. And I suppose that is an area that I think will become more and more important in a decision making process, is how does the voice of lived experience or the voice of future users actually form part of a decision-making process. Now, we haven't cracked it yet, but we're having that conversation at the moment. The potential of setting up sort of nearly a lived experience practice that people can call off to have people with lived experience in the decision-making process. Because ultimately, you know, one of the credibility of the decisions we make is actually, does it meet the expectations of the people that we're serving? So I think it's an area to explore, not in the 30 seconds we've got here, Simon, but it is an area I think we really need to to get better at it, genuine co-design, genuine co-production, genuinely the voice of the patient, client, carer population in our decision-making process. We haven't cracked it, but I just think for me, it's a big thing. It's in my mind at the moment. How do we make that happen?
Thanks, Shane. And there is, I'll signpost to one of the sessions, which by no means cracks it, but that we've had yesterday, which is around improving population involvement in decision-making process around allocation of resources, looking at socio-technical allocation of resources. So I'll signpost to people to that. But yes, an open question. But I'm afraid we have to finish there. So thank you so much for all of your reflections, Toby, and for yours, Shane, and for yours, Amanda. And thanks for everyone for joining us and listening in and offering your suggestions as to areas to talk about. We've still got a great range of sessions coming up in the remaining last few days of the festival. All of the sessions are recorded and generally uploaded within a few days. So if you've missed something, you can easily catch up. And yes, thanks again for joining us, and appreciate you joining us today. Bye for now.